I would like to welcome Professor Peter Cappelli, whose article, The Rise of the Human Capital Industry and Its Implications for Research, jointly written by Shoshana Schwartz, was recently published in Human Resource Management. Welcome to this interview, Peter. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, Jelena.
I have several questions for you today, and they are related to your article. One of them is, why is your study important?
Well, I think if you look at the practice of the way we manage employees, and I think in particular, a lot of the issues that appear in public and in the business press, a lot of them, in retrospect, have turned out to just be wrong. I mean, they were worried about things that were not real problems or that never occurred. And ask yourself, why does that happen? That we spend so much time and energy worrying about issues that just don't matter. You know, in the US in the 2002 or 2003, I would go talk to employers and they're worried about preparing for the coming labor shortage, and there was no coming labor shortage coming, and there was no evidence of this anywhere, except it was something that vendors were claiming. And it started, frankly, with McKinsey making a sort of mistake about looking at the demographic data, saw this smaller cohort of new college graduates and thinking this was going to be a real problem for employers. It wasn't a problem, it didn't matter at all. But a lot of companies spent a lot of time planning and worrying about something that never happened. Or, you know, the big one, which we talk about all the time, is these generational differences, which the U.S. National Academy of Sciences looked into a couple of years ago and concluded it's all fake. There's no evidence for any of these things, that there are these generational differences are just not real. So why are we spending so much time talking about issues in the HR function, spending a lot of time worrying about issues that we know, if you look at carefully, are not even real concerns? Why does this happen? And, you know, another way to think about this is that the agenda of human resources has been kind of hijacked by the vendor world, which is trying to generate concerns and then offer solutions to them. And of course, it's really easy to offer solutions to problems that are not real because nobody's going to know whether you solve the problem or not, right? So that's what bothered me about this, and the, you know, the kind of just lack of awareness. And it's a problem for the practitioners, but it's also a problem for researchers because, you know, we sort of follow what we think practitioners are doing, and we don't quite realize that what they're doing is being driven by this industry behind them. So I was trying to, I guess, bring a little clarity to this strange situation we're in.
So what did you find in this research?
Well, the size of this industry, I mean, I guess I knew a lot. I thought about it. But when Shoshana in particular was going through the financial records and the size of this industry, it's massive. You know, I think we concluded that it was just under $2 trillion a year in terms of revenue. Trillion is a big number. And then if you see what companies spend on marketing, and, you know, maybe 10% or so of their budgets are spent on marketing, and that would be $200 billion spent on marketing. And so now we have a sense of why. They drive the agenda. You know, they drive publications, they drive conferences, they produce all these reports, which are research. You know, you're just swamped with these reports, and they all kind of say the same thing. But an issue becomes topical, and then everybody has to do a report on it, and the reports often have little to do even with their own evidence. And what I guess I found was much bigger than I thought in terms of the scale of this industry now. On the one hand, it's a good thing because what effectively has happened is it's pushed a lot of the tasks from human resources that were done internally out into a marketplace which demonstrates how hugely important they are. If you were to say, we've got this task, this function, which is supported by a $2 trillion industry, you would say, wow. Before that, it was all buried inside companies and you'd never know. And the one good thing for researchers is that this industry and its endless marketing is generating a lot of attention. And so we, in some ways, benefit from that attention. So that's a good thing. The problem is the issues that they're pursuing are largely not particularly real. And there's a huge disconnect between what researchers are thinking about and the way practice is going, right? That's maybe for researchers the biggest issue, right?
Yeah, that's actually the question I was about to ask you, which is really, why does that matter? So what are the implications of your research for our knowledge, for theory, for academics?
I think it's a problem, especially for people in the world of business schools. If you're in the sciences, this is not such an issue. What are the practical questions what are the questions if you're in biomedicine? Well, there's a whole bunch of diseases which are quite in front of you, and you can't pretend that they're not. The agenda is set by nature. In the world of business, you might say those are similar in the sense that changes in business that affect society should be setting the agenda. In the field of human resources, that has not been true for a long time, I'm afraid. That what happened after the 1980s, starting in the US, and we have a way of spreading whatever we're doing around the world, good or bad, is that with the collapse of unions in particular, that function that had been at the board level disappeared. Because when unions went, those executive positions left. Human resources used to report to industrial relations. Human resources was largely internally focused, lifetime employment models and things. And the research was frankly all about making that internal system work. How do we test people carefully to hire? How do we figure out how to promote? How do we build succession plans? All that kind of stuff. And the problem is that agenda more or less just continued research-wise, even when that world had largely disappeared. So, the question of what should we be working on and what should we be focusing on, and should we care so much about theory? I think in human resources, the problem for human resources as a topic area is that it is the preserve of still largely of psychology. Although, let me tell you, the labor economists have taken over. If you were to look at the newspapers, for example, and you wanted to see what newspapers report and who they talk to about workplace issues, it's not human resource faculty. Even on human resource topics, it is economists largely. And why is that? Because they're looking at what's happening in the world right now, and HR people are worried about theory. Now, when they say theory, they are referring back to this model of the great corporations and the issues that came from internal labor markets. So I think, the practice of human resources is making a huge mistake in focusing its attention on developing theory that is really, I think, just a sort of offshoot of psychology. It's not clear that it's changing the way we think about anything. It's not having any effect on practice that I can see. And so, what are we doing? One thing that we're doing is losing the race to the economists because they're stepping in and saying, here's what's actually going on in the workplace, So if you're interested in this field, and especially if you're not at the end of your career, you should think about where it's going to go and how it's going to be and maintain relevance. And that's a big question, right? Broader question for human resources is, can we focus more attention on what is actually happening in the world around us? The equivalent of the sciences, where the research agenda is coming from the world around us and the phenomena. That's what people care about. And that is ultimately where resources come from and faculty lines and all that sort of stuff, The size of this vendor community is, as we said before, a bit of a mixed blessing. On the one hand, this topic of the future of work is now kind of everywhere. The reality of the future of work is that it's, as far as we can tell so far, it's not all that interesting. It's not clear that everything is up in the air the way the industry seems to think it is, right? But I think it is important for researchers to know that the agenda is being driven by these companies. Sometimes you can use that agenda. People are interested in the future of work, so they might be more interested in our research. But I think there's this broader question about, from our paper, about the disconnect between what the vendors are interested in and the reality. I think there's also, as we said before, a disconnect in the HR research community between the reality and these historical, theoretical concerns, which don't seem to relate to very much anymore. So there's kind of two disconnects, right? There's the disconnect on the research side between reality and research topics. And then on the reality side, there's a disconnect between what the vendors are pushing and what is actually happening sort of around us. If you are a researcher and you're trying to get a career and build a career, you will get attention talking about things which are of practical importance. And I can almost promise you that. And if you're not talking about things of practical importance, you will be on the sidelines of a group that is increasingly marginalized.
That's great, which leads me perfectly to the next and final question, which is, what do your results mean for HR policy or the practice of HR?
Well, I think for the practice of HR, I think HR people have to be more aggressive and defensive consumers, right? That they have to sort of defend themselves against these marketing campaigns, basically. And part of the problem they have is that their own business leaders seem to be heavily influenced by these marketing campaigns. So I can tell you, for example, in 2019, I was talking to heads of human resources who were being tasked by their leaders to figure out what they were going to do with all their unemployed truck drivers. Because in 2019, there were these projections that by now, truck drivers would be largely obsolete and on the way out because robotic trucks were going to take over, right? And so part of what HR has to have, I think, is a little more aggressive point of view on these questions that come from the vendors. What do we actually know about generational differences, for example, and why do they matter? Do they really matter, right? What do we actually think will happen with these new technologies like ChatGPT? Is it really going to eliminate all our jobs the way some of the forecasters say? I mean, they've been wrong about everything so far. Do we think they're going to be right about this one? And some of that is a way of arguing up to their own leaders and say, look, we've looked at this. Here's what we think is going to happen in the workplace, rather than waiting and reacting to what the CEOs think. And the CEOs are just getting their views from the business press, right? So can we do a better job of educating our own leaders on the things that we are supposed to know the most about? And that may mean being out of step with what the marketing world is saying about human resources in the future. This is where the research community could, if it was willing, play a much bigger role. And that is to say, here is the reality. Here are the issues that really matter. I can tell you, for example, on these generational differences stories, the demographers always knew this was just silly. There was no evidence for any of this stuff. But they didn't care enough to say anything about it. That's somebody else's problem, right? And as a result, we've wasted all this time and energy worrying about these issues, which aren't even true in the US, let alone thinking that the US generational differences would apply in China and Russia and the rest of the world, which is insane, right? So, could the academic community do more to be the honest broker on these issues? Certainly could. But here again, we have that disconnect, right? If the HR researchers think their job is to build theory for this smaller and smaller group of people who are interested in that topic, while this enormous concern is floating around us, without being addressed, it's a misplaced mission.
Thank you very much for all your thoughts and answers. It was a real pleasure talking to you today, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again at some point in the future about another topic. Thanks a lot.
Good. Thank you, Jelena. Thank you. My pleasure.